Well, welcome. Glad that you're with us. Today is Thursday, February 15th. It does follow February 14th, so here we are at February 15th. And continuing this conversation about the Gospel of Mark, we're up to the 9th chapter, and we found that we've made a turn.
So we had been at Caesarea Philippi, a little further north. Jesus actually comes down to, there's a mount called the Mount of Transfiguration. It's a little further south than Caesarea Philippi. We got to travel there last time I went, and something rather remarkable takes place on this mountain. As we've said, mountains are metaphors for all the Gospels, but especially Mark. Really important events. Revealing events happen on the mountaintop.
Yeah, we know what it means to use the phrase mountaintop experience. Mm-hmm. So here's the mountaintop experience. 6 days later, this is following on Caesarea Philippi, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. So I'm going to pause right there. Why didn't Jesus take all of them?
Yeah, so whenever I think we look in the Bible and you see Peter, James, and John, those were the ones who seemed to be out of the 12, maybe the officers.
Mm-hmm.
They were the ones who
kind of the
inner
inner circle.
The inner circle. And I think we are often invited to put ourselves, Peter, James, John, and Steve, Peter, James, John, and Paul. It's this idea that it's a smaller group. It's much more personal. You're right there with Jesus.
Well, yeah, and it is an interesting thing because, initially when I look at this, I think, wow, he should have taken all 12. But it also says that maybe they were in a different place faith-wise than some of the others, and that we all don't mature in the faith at the same way, at the same pace, at the same rate. And within the aspects of the church, Jesus has always called some apart from others, not to make them lord over anyone else, but so that they can become better servants. Because as we go forward, Peter, James, and John, much more will be asked of them.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just something to pay attention to. And so they go up the mountain, and he was transfigured before them. What does that mean?
So it certainly alludes back to the Old Testament and Moses. If you are familiar with the Old Testament Exodus story, there's a point at which Moses encounters the presence of God as close as he can understand it, and it makes him white.
It glows.
It bleaches him. Yeah, everything about him from that point on, Moses has this odd glow. So I'm certainly thinking that what Mark means for us to understand in this is that this holy moment, this presence of God changes us, and the glow is there.
Yeah, maybe Courtney can do some special effects with Photoshop to make you glow.
That would be quite miraculous.
It would take a bit of fraud to make that happen, to be sure, for both of us.
Yeah.
And so he's transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah, Moses, who...
Right, so let's stop right there for just a second and point out that Elijah and Moses are the two main characters of the Old Testament. Moses is the lawgiver. Elijah is the prophet. So you've got the law and the prophets together on this mountaintop.
Yeah, their Mount Rushmore only would have had two people on it.
Yeah. So, otherwise, there's David and other...
There's Abraham,
really
there's
characters.
Jacob. They all matter, but certainly Moses and Elijah they're the leaders of the two ways of coming close to God. That is through Moses and the law of Moses, and through the words of the prophets.
Right.
So it matters. It's a big deal to the point that Peter, James, and John would have been like, oh, like the rock stars are here, right? These are it doesn't get any bigger than that. So, and Jesus is just talking to them. And then Peter said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings.
Notice first he calls him Rabbi, which is teacher. I could think that he might at this point have thought a little more about him rather than calling him Rabbi, like Lord and Savior. But okay, he calls him teacher. And we're going to build a dwelling. This is one of those fascinating moments. The Jewish faith celebrated the Feast of Booths. It's this idea, it goes back to the tabernacle, that the tabernacle was this mobile place that represented the presence of God. I think what Peter is asking for is to build almost a memorial, something where we could hold on and say, we have experienced the presence of God. We need to build something to commemorate that.
Yeah, and it's always, so I think a way that, does it get any better for Peter than this moment? Almost like, I want to stay here.
Well, we've just come off of chapter 8 in which Peter calls Jesus the Messiah, and Jesus says, you're Satan. So Peter's got to be feeling a little bit down about that. He's been chastised by Jesus, put in this place, and yet he gets to go up on the top of this mountain. He gets to experience this wonderful experience of Moses and Elijah. I mean, gosh, this is awesome.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's also something here that maybe Jesus needed, because Jesus is getting, again, he's heading towards Jerusalem. That pivot's been made in the journey, and he's got this would have been an important moment for Jesus to affirmation, energy, strength to draw on in the times that are ahead.
If you remember back when we talked about the baptism of Jesus, I submit and I truly believe that Jesus needed the affirmation of the Father at his baptism. This is my Son, whom I love, with him I am well pleased. So here, Jesus is making the turn, getting ready to head down the hill straight to Jerusalem to die. And I believe he needed the affirmation of the Father to say, Son, it's time. And yes, you're on the right track and you're doing the right thing. We know in Jesus' human experience, he does not want to do this. He prays in the garden, let this cup pass from me. Jesus understands from a human perspective, this is going to hurt and this is going to be painful. So when the Father says to him, this is my Son, the beloved, listen to him.
Yeah, and it, there's an echo certainly of the baptism, except in this case, in the earlier in his baptism, it's really difficult to understand. Did anyone hear that beyond Jesus? In this case, we're pretty sure James and John and Peter would have heard that too. So otherwise, why would you say listen to him?
Yeah.
Right. So there's a group experience here. I would just, as an aside, say that we all need encouragement. And so can you find a way to encourage someone that I think that's so important. There's so many people who do so much in our congregations. Take a minute to encourage someone. Maybe thank an usher this Sunday. I mean, you may not even think twice about who's out there welcoming people or handing out a bulletin, but maybe at our contemporary service, maybe thank those people who make the coffee every week and say, I really appreciate what you're doing. This means a lot to me.
Yeah, that's a really good thought, Steve.
Or your choir, praise band. There's so many people who serve. Encourage them.
Yeah, and to the affirmation that you noticed, what a great thought.
So that's the kind of guy I am.
You are.
You're just use people up and leave them cast in your wake. I try to encourage people.
And you're so right. I really don't do a particularly great job of celebrating people. It's like, well, you were supposed to do it.
Well, that's because you grew up on that farm in Georgia.
That's right.
You didn't get thanked for working your rear end off. It's like, well, you just did it because, you're supposed to.
Well, picking up Jesus, as they come down the mountain, there's this conversation about Elijah. In Jewish tradition, they left a seat at the Passover meal for the prophet Elijah, because the idea was to be that there was an Elijah who was going to come back, prepare the way for the coming Messiah or the Messianic kingdom. And so certainly Elijah was an important figure for them. The conversation with Jesus and the disciples coming down the mountain is something like, why did the scribes say that Elijah must come first? Jesus says, Elijah is indeed coming first to restore all things. How then is it written about the Son of Man that he's to go through many sufferings and be treated with contempt? But I tell you that Elijah has come, and they did to him whatever they pleased that is written about him. Jesus makes it clear in other Gospels that John the Baptizer, John the Baptist, was Elijah.
Yeah, he fulfills the role of Elijah.
Yeah.
And you get that, and points that out. We talked about that at the beginning with his dress being in the vein of the Old Testament prophet. He's also in the same role as a Nazarene or Nazarite, rather. And so anyway, he's set apart to do exactly that. So what Jesus is trying to show to them, this is happening as the Old Testament said it would, or in their case, as the Scriptures would. So tomorrow we'll talk about what happens when they get at the bottom of the mountain, and so there's an interesting parallel here back to the Old Testament, and we'll talk about that tomorrow.
Thank you for joining. See you tomorrow.
Thank you.